World War II, an era of fighting, hatred, and arrogance. From concentration camps to the battlefield, this devastating event resulted in the deaths of millions of innocent people. In the Philippines, the Japanese tortured and murdered countless civilians and prisoners of war. The Filipino guerrillas in the American Liberation Front had no choice but to fight back to avenge the deaths of innocent people and to save the lives of thousands of other Filipinos and Americans. On November 15, 1935, the government of the Commonwealth of the Philippines had just been created. 6 years later, this newly established government was not ready for a Japanese invasion, nor were the American forces in the right state to help defend them. It was December 7th at 7:48 a.m. in Hawaii. Japanese dive bombers bearing the red symbol of the rising sun of Japan swarmed the islands of Oahu. The Japanese warplanes descended on the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor. 11 hours later, Japanese bombers flew over Clark Field, an American Air Force base in the Philippines. The attacks on Pearl Harbor foreshadowed an attack on the Philippine Islands, but the Japanese had the Americans too distracted. The warnings of the attack came too late, and the startled Americans were caught off guard. After the bombings of Pearl Harbor and Clark Field, Japanese troops landed in northern Luzon on December 9th, prepared to attack the Philippines. Over the days, more troops started to join the invasion, and the Japanese were becoming unstoppable. A total of 43,000 troops landed on the islands and began the invasion of Luzon. The American troops were ordered to evacuate Manila, as the Japanese were overpowering the forces. As a result, the American headquarters were changed to Corregidor and Manila became a defenseless city. On January 9, 1942, the first attack on Bataan by the Japanese begins. This continued until April 9th of the same year. The U.S. surrender on that day, one of the biggest in American history, forced 75,000 troops to be captured and marched the so-called Bataan Death March. During the march, 6,000 to 7,000 prisoners died. The surviving prisoners were taken to Camp O'Donnell, where over 150 Americans and 22,000 Filipinos were killed. The invasion continued, and on March 5th and 6th, 1942, the Japanese regime forced the U.S. troops out of Corregidor and retreat to Australia. By the time of the U.S. retreat from the islands in 1942, the Japanese had control of 40% of the Philippines, the rest in control of the resistant Filipino guerrilla forces. The guerrilla forces consisted of primarily Filipino troops, with the addition of a few Chinese and American soldiers. They were known to be brutal, untraditional fighters. These forces performed small occasional ambushes when the Japanese troops weren't looking, which had been very effective considering how much the Japanese forces outnumbered the Filipino guerrillas. Many of the guerrilla forces had the important role of being spies for the American army. They had secretly provided proper food and water for the prisoners of war, gathered crucial information of the Japanese plans, and smuggled resources and guns from the Japanese army.
Generally, the role of the guerrilla forces in contact with American forces secretly was to wait and to watch, to spy, to gather information, to kind of siphon out food supplies that they were receiving from the outside world. They were very valiant, very heroic. They did a lot. They certainly took a stand against the Japanese by resisting their efforts to control morale and control thought.
Without these guerrilla forces, the Americans may not have been able to grant freedom to the Philippines from the Japanese. Even though the guerrilla forces were culturally diverse and were scattered across the Philippines, they were united under one general, Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur is considered one of the most important figures in the history of the Philippines. MacArthur was a U.S. general who led the American troops and the Philippine guerrillas in the heroic battles against the Japanese. Immediately after arriving in Australia after his retreat from the Japanese invasion, he spoke with the Australian press and gave a message to the Philippines.
When I landed on your soil, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return.
The Filipinos held those words as a promise. they were a sign of hope and courage for the people of the Philippines. To this day, General MacArthur is deemed as a national hero and a profound leader for the independence of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. Espionage was common among the women of the Philippines. The Japanese didn't see women as a threat to their plans of attack, so the Filipino woman could easily gather important information from their plans. One example of an extraordinary woman who assisted the Filipino guerrillas and American forces to defeat the Japanese is Claire Phillips. She was captured by the Japanese and was one of their prisoners of war. She was given the choice to take a job at a Japanese nightclub to avoid internment. From that job, she took key information from Japanese officers and provided it to the guerrilla forces and American Army. Women were not only involved as spies, but as nurses too. The Angels of Bataan were a group of Filipino and American women who served as nurses during the Battle of Manila as they were posted to the hospitals. They knew the threat that the Japanese posed, but they still took a stand against them because they were dedicated to help the Filipinos gain their freedom. Back in the Philippines, the Filipino and American soldiers resisting the Japanese were forced to become POWs after surrendering to their forces. On October 20th of 1944, Douglas MacArthur had kept his promise and returned to the islands of the Philippines, along with reinforcements. An assault was launched by MacArthur as they attacked the east coast of Leyte. That same day, Douglas MacArthur announced to the people of the Philippines over radio that he had returned to the Philippines.
People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated in the blood of our two people.
The Japanese counterattacked the US Navy, and a few days later, what is arguably the largest naval battle in history ensues between the Japanese and the Americans. When the battle was over, the Japanese Navy was crippled, and the United States had nearly total control over the Philippine Sea. On land, the American forces and the Filipino guerrillas gained ground and moved through the Philippines, liberating cities on their way, therefore achieving their name, the American Liberation Front. They moved on to the northern part of the islands, and although there was a large Japanese counterattack, the invasion of the islands were so far successful. The US forces and the Filipino guerrillas landed on Luzon on January 10, 1945. On January 21st and 22nd, there was heavy fighting between the Liberation Front and the Japanese, resulting in the infamous Battle of Luzon. A few days later, the Battle of Manila began on February 3rd and ended a month later. Around 100,000 people were killed in the Manila Massacre, and the city of Manila was bombed.
There's the idea that they were burning down buildings, a lot of them with people still in them. They were shooting and killing and bayoneting civilians, and just intentionally causing as much destruction, as much death as they could. Their effort at resisting being pushed out of the city was really just to do a lot of terrible things to the people, to the civilians living in the city at the time. So the city was mostly burned down and destroyed, and a lot of civilians that shouldn't have been were killed or potentially raped or tortured.
On August 6th, the US dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima and dropped another bomb 2 days later on Nagasaki. Finally, on the 15th of August, Emperor Hirohito announced that the Japanese were surrendering. On July 4th, 1946, the US and the Philippines signed the Treaty of Manila, a document that granted the Philippines full independence. After 333 years of Spanish occupation, along with 48 years under American rule, they had finally gotten their promised independence from the United States. Ever since the Americans promised the Philippines their independence on July 4th, 1946, they filled the Filipinos with a sense of nationalism. The resistance movement showed how the effort of the United Filipinos took a stand against the Japanese and fought for their rightful country. When the Japanese invaded the islands, the Filipino guerrillas and soldiers stood up against them and chose to fight because they believed in uniting and finally liberating their nation. As the POWs endured the inhumane acts of the Japanese in their plan to take over the islands, the Americans and Filipinos were determined to defeat them together to take a stand against their forces. World War II was an era of devastation and destruction. The Filipinos stood against this mayhem to defend their land from further persecution. These unsung heroes, who were determined to defeat the Japanese, will always be remembered as the Fighting Filipinos.